Okay. It's 8:30. I'm German. I need to be on time, so I get started. So a couple of weeks ago at the SharePoint conference, we announced a bunch of new exciting things, and one of these exciting things were a series of APIs that we added to Exchange. And if you are curious about what all these APIs are about and how to use them and get kickstarted, this is a session for you. So we let you know how exactly that works. So good morning, I would say. And my name is Matthias Leibmann. I'm a broker manager in the Outlook extensibility team. That's a team in Exchange that takes care of all the APIs and how you can build nice little apps on top of our wonderful server and online services. And
I'm Rohit. I am also a program manager in the extensibility team. And I'll talk about the REST APIs more in depth after Matthias gives you guys an intro on the auth portion of it.
And I need to get the PowerPoint presentation under control. With this, there's a little kind of thing that I can use. OK, so there are two main objectives that we have in that session. So Rohit mentioned it. So the first part, we talk about, hey, we have these nice APIs that we want to use, but how do you actually get to those APIs? So you have to do some stuff, right? We are not letting just everybody use the APIs and get access to users' data, right? So we talk about how can you actually authenticate to all these APIs. And the second part is then, hey, right, you're authenticated. Now you can actually do some real work and exciting stuff in your application, right? And we all want to do this based on a kind of a sample application that we sort of develop during the course of this session. I don't know if my mic gave up or not, but it sounds certainly weirder than before. Just some context setting there. If you look at the Office 365 platform, is my mic on?
Yes, it is.
OK, I don't hear anything. That's probably good. So the Office 365 platform, how you know it, or at least have some insights into that, is we roughly talk about applications in two main categories, right? There are contextual apps, and these are the applications that we focused on mainly in the last release, right? If you work with mail applications, right? So these are applications that actually are loaded into the Office 365 environments, into our clients, that you can write to enrich the Office 365 services. So these are contextual applications, right, living inside Office 365. Now, in this release, we actually focused, as part of Office 365, on a little bit the reverse part. We are actually trying to expose APIs that you can use externally in your application, meaning web applications and native applications. So, and this one gives you kind of both ways how you can integrate with Office 365. One, inside contextual applications, you write your Agave apps, your mail applications, or you can use your web server applications to now enrich those with the Office APIs that we are exposing. OK, so I briefly mentioned we want to build something with you in the course of these 75 minutes. And we actually picked kind of a sample application that we call Session Picker Demo. That's a native store application. And it signs on to Office 365. And then it gets a list from SharePoint that has a bunch of sessions. And we actually want to stick these sessions into the Exchange calendar and send some email and all around that. So we want to give you roughly a feeling how you go about building an application like that. OK, but before we get into that excitement, there's a little bit of a piece called authentication that you have to pass. And they did some very nice changes there that we believe will help you tremendously in your applications. So if you look in the past, what you actually had to do to get to Exchange, and especially to Exchange Online, there was not a lot of options what you had if you want to actually authenticate. Right? So under the cover, it was all basic auth. So what that meant for your application is you basically always had to reinvent the wheel. Right? Meaning you need to come up with your own sign-on dialogues. Right? Need to think about, hey, how do you password management around that? Right? So essentially, right, maybe you got some very critical questions from your customer saying, hey, right, I'm typing in here a username and password, right? How do you keep your application secure? and making sure the username and password doesn't get out of control there, right? So, and you have to think about all this kind of management around this, all this around UI around that, right? And on top of that, you actually had to do this for all the Office 365 APIs that you like to address for your APIs. So Exchange authenticated differently than SharePoint, and Lync authenticated differently than Exchange. So it was not very easy to do. So we looked at that and we thought, okay, that's really a lot of improvement that we should do. And that's exactly what we did. And what we basically did in the course of the past 12 to 15 months to come up with a framework of authentication that sits on top of Windows Azure Active Directory, right? Or sometimes also referenced as org ID or organizational account. So we are using the same authentication framework for applications now that we use for our own Office 365 services. That is basically what it means. Meaning, when you write your application now in this new way, your users of the application has exactly the same experience, like with the Office 365 apps that your users use anyways. So this also means, by the way, right, and this is one important thing, whatever administrative controls sit on top of your user accounts, they also apply to your application. So we have this nice feature of two-factor authentication in Office 365 now. Meaning you can mark a user account to be subject, for example, for phone factor authentication. As soon as you do that and you integrate your application in the new framework, your application does exactly the same things, exactly the same experience, boom, right? Without you having to worry about what you would have to do in the past. How do you integrate smart cards in your app? Right? A huge problem, right? Now with this new framework, it comes with the nature of being integrated in the authentication environment that Office 365 offers anyways. So now after that, looking back to our little problem, or one more problem to the approach we had in the past, after you have the username and password, essentially the application could do anything and everything that the user can do, meaning it could access all the data of the user itself. So it was not necessarily fine-grained in terms of, hey, I only want to build a calendar application. Right, while you were able to do this, the credentials that the user provided, right, still had access to all the data beyond calendars. So what we also put in front of that is a new authorization framework that we also use based on the Windows Azure Active Directory, which we call combined consent. And what this enables you to do, to basically say, hey, my application only want to do calendar. My application only want to do mail. My application only want to work with contacts, or it wants to work with all of that, right? And then the user can actually see and decide, right, this is indeed, right, what I'm agreeing to. This application is okay to work with my calendar, my mail, and then the application is constrained in that way what it can actually do on behalf of the user. So here's briefly some benefits that we see, right, that you gain out of that, right? So you write the code only once, regardless what Office 365 API you use. Right? If you start with an Exchange application and you want to add SharePoint functionality, there's not much more you have to do in order to integrate with SharePoint, right? You are authenticated, right? You get access to SharePoint by the same framework. There is no more credential management. Everything that you see, all these dialogues, yeah, the user types in the password, but they're all server-driven out of the organizational account framework, right? So the password never makes it into your application. You don't have to worry about, hey, how do I actually deal with this explicit credential management? The granular permission I mentioned. And one of the other good news, all what you see right now, or what we talk about, or this new framework, is based on the OAuth2 protocol, which a lot of the developer community know by connecting to other services, such as Facebook or the Googles of the world, right? Exactly the same protocol. If you know it, you can apply it and use it right away with Office 365. I talked a little bit about the sign-on differentiators. What I didn't mention, of course, but it also applies if you are in a federated deployment, meaning you have ADFS on-premise and use your on-premise accounts to sign into the cloud. It works the same way. So meaning you use your on-premise users and you integrate with your application into the same authentication flow. So how do I do about it if I want to get started in my application to integrate with this new auth framework? So I mentioned it a couple of times now. We integrate with a service called Windows Azure Active Directory. And Windows Azure Active Directory provides functionality where you can actually register your application. So that is one of the first steps what you would have to do. You somehow need to get into Windows Azure Active Directory, get there a tenancy, which if you have already an Office 365 tenant, it is there. So there's no additional work, there's no additional subscription that you actually have to do. It will be there. But there is this concept, what we call an ISV tenant, and that is actually not anything different than a normal regular Office 365 tenant. It's just a naming that we have chosen, basically say, hey, it might be a good idea that when you want to register an application, do it in a separate own tenant, separate from user accounts or other things that you want to manage. Right? Because you want to make this application available to all the other tenants. That is, at the end of the day, your goal. And as part of this first registration, so you pick any tenancy you like in Office 365, Azure Active Directory, say, hey, I want to create a new application. I want to make this application available for other Office 365 tenancy, and you give it some kind of properties. If you are familiar with the OAuth world, right, you get a client ID, you get a client secret. If you're a web server app, right, you configure your redirect URLs and all the good stuff, and you configure the permissions that you want from our APIs, right? So now you defined your application. And now comes basically runtime, right? Somebody uses your application and somebody signs on, like the screens that you saw in my second or third slide, right? Types in the username, sees this nice consent dialog, and then some magic happens, right? Meaning the magic is when you sign on with an organizational account, what actually happens based on the client ID and the application you configured, this information makes it into the tenancy or into the Office 365 organization that's of the user that's currently signed on, right? Meaning we create certain entries there that then helps the Office 365 organization to see, hey, these are the applications my users have consented to, right? And then can be managed there, they can be revoked there, right? And you can do all kinds of interesting app management and see what's going on with the application there. So let's talk a little bit about different modes, how you can think about using this framework. Right, so an example of a web server app. I think about a web server app we had now for quite a while. We offered you can do a single sign-on from your web server app into Office 365. That is one thing you can do, right? So this doesn't necessarily give you access to these APIs, right? That's kind of, yeah, we have single sign-on in your web server application with Office 365, right? And then there are two, with the frameworks that we are talking about now, you can basically add the API access. And then we are thinking about there's actually two kind of different things you can do. First of all, you can have individual users sign up to use Office 365 functionality, right? So this is basically, hey, right, I am a user of an organization, right? I want to use this application, right? There is an entry point in the web server app that basically says, hey, right here, you can enrich the experience by integrating with the calendar in Exchange in Office 365, right? So user consent happens, right? And the application can work only with the application of this user that just signed up in your web application. So we have, in addition to that, there's one interesting kind of spin on that is that the web application could also offer an entry point saying, hey, right, do you want to sign up the complete organization for the application? Right? So it's kind of a separate kind of thing, right? The first one was, hey, an end user said, hey, I want to allow this application access to my calendar, right? This entry point will say, hey, right, I'm the administrator of an organization, and I really like to integrate my whole organization with this application, right? And then essentially the same thing happens consent gets invoked with the authentication framework. Authentication happens, and you need to be an administrator then to basically allow this kind of access and integrate this application with the whole organization. Right? And after that happens, you essentially made this application available to every user. So a user then using this web server app authenticates with his org ID, will be not presented with something like a consent because the administrator says, right, all my users should be allowed, or I consent this application, right, for all of my users to access, for example, the calendar APIs. And they're all very similar, so there's not a lot of things. That's one of the beauty of this model, by the way, so I somehow get a bit lost here, I think. It uses the same OAuth2 protocol. You just have to decorate one of the initial requests that you do to the authentication or authorization endpoint to say, hey, I want to execute the admin consent path versus the end user path. Right? So what we are also working on, by the way, it's not quite ready. Right? If you still want to do single sign-on, right? We are working on also making this using the OAuth2-based protocol, OpenID Connect. It will take a couple of more weeks, right? But we are pretty close announcing that too. Right now, it's if you want to do a single sign-on, you still need to use the old WSFET SAML-based framework. Okay. With that, so we talked about we want to do a little demo app there. So one of the first things what I have to do here is to register my application. So I need to go to the Windows Azure portal and sign on there to my ISV tenant or tenancy that I want to register my application. Okay, so I'm signing in. And oops. So if you see the screen, don't panic. So really, don't panic. So I had an Office 365 tenancy, and I tried to get into the Windows Azure portal to manage my applications. Unfortunately, right now, there's a little quirk that very smart people in Redmond work on to get rid of, that while you have Windows Azure Active Directory already, it's not enabled in the Windows Azure portal. So what you want to do there, in order to get that, right, you say sign up for Windows Azure. And unfortunately, you need to go through a sign-up process, and you need to enter some credit card information. But be assured, this functionality is free, and we will work on that to make this more seamless, and you don't have to do this. Just don't panic. So let's go back. Let's sign out again. And this time I'm so what I'm doing here, I'm actually did some little trick in terms of using a Microsoft account to log on to Windows Azure and integrate my Office 365 directory into the portal. So there is actually a way how you can do this. And so that's my Contoso tenancy. That's an Office 365 tenancy that I have. And there's a tab called Applications. And this is all the applications that are currently registered in this tenancy. So now let's create a new application. Let's say I want to click Add. I say, hey, that is an application my organization is developing. I give it a name. Right, and then I decide, is this a web application or is this a native client application? Right, so web application, I have to define some more properties. Right, we said so with the session picker, we actually want to develop a native application. In our example, it's a Windows Store application. Right, I need to give it some redirect URI. And then that's all what the initial wizard will actually ask me to do. And then I go to configure. So right now, I only created the application. I created a client ID that I can actually use, but I haven't actually said what kind of permissions I want in this application. Right? So if you scroll down in this registration page, what you will actually see, permissions to other applications. And there you find things like, hey, there's Exchange 365 online, right? And then you see, hey, these are all the applications that are available for your application in the next drop-down box, right? And here you select, hey, okay, I wanna have full access to the calendar in our example, and I want to send email. So I added 2 permissions in Exchange Online. Hey, and I also want to read from SharePoint something. So I want to go to SharePoint and say, hey, I want to read items inside collections. And then I save the application. So that's actually all what you have to do to basically get your application bootstrapped. And then I show you in a couple of minutes how exactly you do this and actually use this client ID that you just created. So one important thing, we created a native application there. So per definition, native applications, when you create them, they are available for other Office 365 tenants, right? Not only for your tenancy. So that's quite kind of logical, because you need to somehow get the bits for the client to install on a device, right, in order to sign on and use the app. It's slightly different for web server apps. I haven't showed you that, right? But I could, for example, here go to a web server app that I will demo pretty soon, and there is kind of a toggle that you can switch. Hey, should this be an application that's only available for my tenant, or do I want to make it available outside my tenancy too? So when you start playing around, be aware that for web server apps, in order for them to work in other tenants, then you actually register the app, you need to switch this around. Okay, so everything is based on OAuth2, on the OAuth2 protocol. I briefly mentioned, so I quickly want to walk you through some basic flow for web server app. Because there is a slight nuance to the flow that you might not necessarily know from working with other OAuth2 APIs. Right? So how you initialize an OAuth2 authentication is by sending an authorization request to an authorization endpoint. So that's exactly what your application also does. So now what you also tell with this authorization request, and this is where it's slightly different, you basically say, hey, I want to have an authorization for Exchange, for this resource Exchange. And the reason why we...
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
What's the difference between this and that Napa tools? I mean, the Napa tools, they seem to be more C-based code or something. You have to be more of a programmer to write the code. Is this all GUI stuff to make these different apps?
No, we are not stopping to make these different apps. Right? The Napa tools we did in 15 to basically help you developing the Agave apps, the SharePoint apps, right? And they will continue to live, right? They're using a slightly different framework, and we are working right now with a team to actually move all the authentication work that happened in Napa under the cover, right, to this new framework. It will take a little bit of time, right? But these tools, these developer tools, will continue to exist. Right, so no worries there, right? Okay. So you initiate the flow, hitting the authorization server, right? Say, hey, I want to have a token for Exchange, right? And you get a code back, an authorization code, right? What you do not specify there, and what you might also know from working with other OAuth providers, is you do not specify any permissions that your application want to have. So there is the scope parameter that you pass, for example, with Google or with LinkedIn, right? And here you actually pre-configured the permission your application want to have with your application registration. So you do not have to specify that during runtime. And then you basically use this code and you hit the token issuing endpoint and you get actually back a refresh token and an access token. Now the access token is for the resource that you ask for exchange. Right, so that's important. And you use this access token to actually access our APIs, our Exchange APIs, the calendar, the contacts, the mail. Right? So, and you have a refresh token, and you have a web server app, and you probably keep this refresh token because it's a little bit longer living, right? And then you want to basically call a SharePoint API. So what are you going to do? Right? You surely do not want to go to an authorization request again where you bother the user with the consent screen and so on. Right? So basically you can use the refresh token actually to get additional access token for different Office 365 APIs. So that is a slightly kind of nuance that we did second in this OAuth flow, that you can actually use one single refresh token after you acquired it in the authorization request together with a combined consent that has all the permissions, SharePoint, Exchange, right? And then you can use this refresh token to go back to the token issuing endpoint to get these additional access tokens. Yes?
Does the user consent challenge get done one time, or does the user consent challenge get done one time, or is that challenged every time the user wants to go use that one app?
That is a very good question. So the user is only consented one time initially, right? And then it all depends, right? So that's in general the case, right? So for web server applications, this consent is actually recorded in the Active Directory tenancy of the organization where the organizational account of the user lives, right? Meaning you see then this user consented to this application, the user can go there, they can revoke the permissions, right, to this application, right? When the revocation happens and the user tries to use the web app again, of course, another consent happens, right? So now for device applications, it's slightly different. Device applications, the consent is actually recorded in the refresh token. Meaning when you are on your phone and you consent, the phone actually has the consent. When you use a different phone and you start the application there, there's another consent because it's a different device, right? So this is roughly just some points there, okay? So authentication to multiple workloads, right? So I briefly mentioned that in the flow diagram. Right? We have something like an access token. You need an access token for the different Office 365 APIs you want to access, right? So, but you can acquire this access token by using the same initial code flow where you get the refresh token back, right? So you don't have to always do this dance. So now a little bit of the autonomy of the access token and refresh token as a developer, right? So access tokens are valid for about 1 hour. And this is how it is right now. They're relatively short-living. That's the advice. And when you write an application, you actually want to react to that. So don't worry too much about, hey, it's only valid for 1 hour. It's only an access token is for 1 hour. What you typically want to do in your application, when the API gives you back a 401, and we give you back some nicer reason why the access was denied too, but when the API says, hey, 401, access denied, what you want to do is you want to go back with your refresh token and get a new access token and replay the request, right? And this will resolve the issue. So now what about the refresh token, right? So for all purposes, right, the same kind of rules apply. Don't think too much about how long is this valid, right? Right now we decided it's valid for 3 months, and when you don't use it for 2 weeks, it gets invalid, and we have all these nice rules around that. That might change at any point in time. When you can be very smart about that too. When you use the refresh token and go back to get a new access token, the token issuing endpoint actually will give you also an error message back that says, hey, this refresh token became invalid. One of the events, for example, what's currently there is when the user changes the password, all the refresh tokens gets invalidated, right? So you need to react to that event and eventually go back to the authorization endpoint, right, to get a new refresh token and access token. Now, will consent happen for device applications? Yes, it will. Right? For web server apps, the consents are still recorded in AAD, right? So the user will not see a consent in that case. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit how you can actually use some of the token information in your application. So there are two specific kind of info. So the token is actually a JSON web token, right? You can really very easily look inside. It's not encrypted, right? It's clear text, JSON encoded, with a signature, of course, signed by the token issuer, right? But if you look inside the token, and especially when you get two information, and this is the tenant ID, and this is actually the object ID. So how can you use those? And we do not recommend you to use any of these other informations in your application, by the way, right? So if you want to build your own user profile store, for example, or you want to build your own tracking about what users actually already used my app and signed on, right? You can use the OID claim, right? That is basically a GUID that uniquely identify the user across all the tenancies in Office 365. Right? If you want to see if an organization already signed up in your application, you can use actually the TID or tenant ID claim, which is another GUID that basically says, hey, an administrator, right, has basically consented to the application, and you can mark this in your app, meaning when a user signs on, for example, right, in your app, and you see, hey, this user has this tenancy, you could check, hey, did an administrator consent already for my application for this tenancy? So you do not have to actually then bother the user, right, and can immediately say, right, hey, user, you have this functionality available, and light that up. Okay, so here's a little kind of just sign out here. Just want to give you another quick demo. No, sorry. So that's a little web application that I wrote that I use to see how actually the protocol works. Right? Feel free to play around there too. It's a web server app. You can consent if you have your Office 365 application. I promise I don't do anything evil, other than you can play around and see how the protocol works. Right? So I say, hey, I want to basically do admin consent, right? And this is basically, let me just make this a little bit bigger. Okay, so that's basically the request I send to the authorization endpoint, right? Standard OAuth flow, right? I say, hey, I want to have an authorization code back. This is my client ID. This is my redirect URI that I'm having, right, to my OAuth Play website. This is the resource. That's a parameter that you might not be familiar with, right? You specify that, hey, I want to have a token for, in this example, for the graph, right? And I want to exercise an admin consent. Removing that will just do user consent, but I want to just go and do admin consent for now, and then I need to be an admin. And what I should see in a couple of seconds and is hopefully a nice little consent screen that tells me what my application want to do. Here it is, and why it took so long, I have no idea. So that's my application, how I registered it. It says, hey, right, I want to read the user's profile that is out of AAD. Right, I want to read the user's contacts. I want to read user's calendars. I want to read user's mail. Right, and I said, okay. Right, and then it goes back to my application. They said, hey, here's your code. Right. And then what you do, again, standard OAuth flow, you go back to the token issuing endpoint. You say, hey, I have an authorization code. That's my redirect URI, right? All the good stuff. And then you go, and then you get basically the code back, right? So it's JSON formatted, right? There's in the response is an access token. Just remove that we see a little bit. There's some other information. It's kind of funny that it started to appear now as 3599, that is 1 hour. It used to be 3600, so I don't know where the second is left. So this token is valid for 1 hour. There's a refresh token, right? It was for the scope profile read, and there's also another token. Now, if you want to look inside the access token, right, there's a nice little tool, right, that basically says, hey, here, that's an access token for the graph. Audience is for the graph, right? That's this user signed on, right? Don't use a UPN. Don't use a UPN in your app. Use this, the OID, right? So, and it is for user profile read. Right? So now, what happens if I want to have a token for exchange? Right? So let's just switch this around. Right? So I do not have an authorization code, but I have a refresh token, and I basically make another request to the token issuing endpoint. Hey, I have a refresh token. That's my client ID, and all the good stuff. Right? And at the end, right, I say, hey, this time I want to have actually a token for exchange, which is outlook.office365.com. So we get the same response back. Right, but if I look inside the token, right now it's, hey, it is for exchange, it is for those scopes, but it's the same user. For those who can remember quits very fast. Okay, almost at the end before the API work, or the API part. So these are the bare bones what I showed you. So if you write an application in PHP, right, or Ruby or any other, right, this is probably what you need. Right? If you write on the Microsoft platform, right, or on iOS, on Android, right, we have some better news to tell you, because we have client libraries available that encapsulates all this protocol flow for you. Right? So if you want to write a Windows Store app, we have a client library. And they're all basically called under the umbrella of Active Directory Authentication Library, or ADAL, right? So they basically deal with all these semantics about, hey, the refresh token, the access token, right, initiating the flow. So you don't have to do this in your application if you can use one of these client libraries, right? And we do have these available for Android and OS too. Right, so they basically deal with, hey, they cache this access token, they cache the refresh token, build semantics around that, right? And it's a really nice kind of protocol. And we strongly recommend you, if you can, use these libraries, because they give you these additional functionalities that you might have to build otherwise. Okay. So how easy it is to use those libraries. So I will show you in a second on our Session Picker demo app that we want to do, what exactly how we actually code this. But one of the first things what you do, you basically say, hey, I want to use this client library, and this is the authentication server that I want to go to, that I want to use. That basically sets the context for the authentication library. All right, in this example, I'm using login.windows.net/common. Right. That is basically the production endpoint of worldwide token issuing endpoint for our data centers in AAD. Right, so I'm setting that, and then I'm getting the first access token. Right, I'm basically then using acquire token. Right, and this is the resource I want to have this token for. Right, that's all you do. You don't have to worry about doing the code flow, going back. That happens all under the cover. You only say that is my client ID. Right, if you have a web server app. Right, you also pass the secret of the web server app at that point, right? But you say, hey, I want to have a token back for Office 365 for Exchange, and then you can use this token and put it on the requests, right? And how do you put it on the requests? Right, you put it into a standard authorization header that you play with the HTTP request. That's called bearer, right? And you just attach this access token to that. Now, if you want to get more tokens, what are you going to do? Right, simply, all you do like you do with the first access token. You basically say, hey, right, there's my client ID, and I want to have a token for Contoso, or SharePoint.com, for a SharePoint site in Contoso in this example. Okay. So how do we go that about our Session Picker app? Right, here's my little app, Windows Store app, like mentioned many times now. I put just a simple button in there, sign in to get my session list or sign into my application. Right, so this is what we started. Right, then I go into my code, right, and I just gonna run it, and we're stepping through this while I do it. So one of the first things what I do in my app is what you saw on the slide. I basically initialize my authentication context. Right, I have it in a class. The authority is what you saw in the slide. It's the token issuing endpoint or the endpoint of AAD there. Right. And then nothing happens. My application started. I built the authentication context, and then the user signs in to get the session list. And this is my first request that I'm doing. We're using the Active Directory authentication library. I say I want to have a token. I want to have it for the graph. Right? That is my application, my client ID. Right? Note that all the access tokens down there are empty. Right? So now I'm pressing F5. That's all I'm going to do. So now what happens under the cover, right? ADLL discovered, hey, I don't have an access token yet and the refresh token yet. So or I need to sign on this user, right? So who are you, right? Authentication. It's going to happen. So I had nothing to do in my application. ADLL took care of prompting using the organizational ID prompt there. Oops. Right, and then basically says, hey, this application want to do following things. Right, that's consent again. That happened, right, after authentication. I bootstrapped the application. I said, okay. And then I'm back in my application, right? And just because we want to have tokens for 3 different services in our session picker app, right? Now I basically say, hey, I want to get the next token, and I want to have a token for this time exchange. And this is actually our internal pre-production environment, so don't use this. You will not be successful. Use the one that you saw in the slides. So we haven't switched our application yet to a real production tenant. So, but it is a token for exchange. But I'm not getting prompted, and I'm not getting consented, right? Because I already went through that, right? So ADL was smart enough to do that, right? And now basically I'm having 3 access tokens, right? One for AAD, one for Exchange, and one for SharePoint. I quickly stepped over the SharePoint one, right? And then I basically can do real work, right? In just for you to see that something happens, right? I have a class passing in the access token for an AAD to make an API call to the graph to read my my display name and my email address out of that. Wasn't that easy? No? Okay. So that's roughly basically what we talked about, right? How you go about building your applications. That's a quick summary, right? So register your application in Azure AD, right? In a special tenant, right? It's nothing. If you want to do it in your Office 365 tenant, no one stops you that. There is not a big problem, right? But you might want to consider having a separate tenancy to register your application, right? Configure the permissions that your application want to need in the portal. Right. There is actually another very nice way how you can do this, and is a session tomorrow at 1:45 about building line of business applications, I believe, by my boss, British. He watches me and see if I don't say anything stupid here. Give me good ratings, please. Okay. He will actually show you another way, because we made this even simple by integrating some very nice tool into Visual Studio. You will see it in his session. So, okay, and then you build your app code, right? That is basically what we just did, right? Building app code. Then basically you can actually test your consent flow before you go live, right? By Windows Azure actually allows you to easily create additional tenancies, right? So while you don't need a full Office 365 subscription, so you can exercise the consent flow, the protocol, right? without even have to worry about that, right? You can test your revocation, right, going through back to the Azure portal again. If you want to learn about management, Pratif is your man tomorrow. He will show you how to manage these applications a little bit more in the portal. I wanted to focus more about the development side, right? And then you deploy your application. And deployment means, right, literally making your code live, right, for web server applications, pulling the switch of being a single-tenant application to a multi-tenant application, right, and then you're ready to go, right? So that's the Visual Studio tooling I was quickly mentioning. Said that, now the authentication part is done, and we talk about a little bit more about what you can actually do with the access token by looking into the various REST APIs.
All right. Everybody still here? Okay, so Matthias kind of showed you how you can access various services. And I'm going to show you what you can do with those access tokens. Right now you've done all the part. You've registered your application. Now you've gotten the tokens. What are the cool things that you can do? What are the features you can access? So I'll be introducing the mail, calendar, contact, REST APIs. I'll talk about the why, the what, and we will continue to build that app, which will use these APIs in a native app. So, there. All right, why? Well, Exchange has many, many petabytes of data, and this data is growing rapidly. What this allows you to access this data, manipulate this data, and create applications across various platforms. So as you learned earlier, applications can be built for various platforms like mobile, in Android, in Windows, and Windows 8 app. And by allowing a user to consent only for the permissions that your app needs, you're going to make the adoption much higher. Because where you ask a user for the keys to the whole kingdom is not very conducive. Not here. That's clear now? Better? All right. So, the old environment of having your app basically consent for everything is not very conducive for applications because a lot of folks are very wary. For example, you might have a person who is not very comfortable giving mail send privileges to an app, but she's completely fine in allowing the app to write emails and store them away in a drafts folder, which you can review later and send herself. So that's what this allows you to do. And again, this is based on OData, JSON, which allows quick ramp up, right? You have developers who know this language today. They can quickly come and reduce the cost of development for your organization. It also allows for a diverse ecosystem where your apps can play with the various applications that support these platforms. Again, the web-friendly APIs, as I just mentioned, are HTTP REST-based, so it's easy to plug and play and develop. So what are we building? We'll go and a little bit more what are the different features. Big advantages is that by using OData, one of the features that you get is a service metadata, which basically is a listing of all the different functionality that the service is going to offer you. So it lists the entities, the collections, the actions, all in one place. It enables basically you to point tools to the service metadata and generate proxies, serializes, deserializes, so you don't have to do that. This is a small sample. I don't think you can see much, but it has a message class with the different properties on there, and it explains what each type is, what are the different actions you can perform. I'll go in a little bit later. So once you have the service metadata, you can go to the service root, which is OutlookOffice365.com, and from EWS OData, if you see down below, you can do two things. You can either jump into the metadata, which we saw earlier, and explore the API and understand what are the different services offered, or you can go to the top-level entity, which is user. So there are two ways to access user. One, using the collection, you can give the SMTP address and say, OK, I want to look at users of Rohit at Microsoft.com. Or we have a simple singleton, which is an alias, which basically represents the authenticated user. So you can use me. That's equal to users of Rohit at Microsoft.com. This is the convenience. So when is it available? It's available today. We announced, as Matthias was saying, this a couple of weeks ago at SharePoint conference. It's in preview mode. We are looking for feedback from you folks we can improve it and also add more features to it. In fact, I would say anybody who has an Exchange Online account can try it now. You can open a browser, hit that URL, and you'll be prompted. Of course, you'll be prompted. You can enter your basic auth credentials, which Matthias doesn't like. But for exploring the API, you can definitely go try it out. You can go to Inbox. You can look at your messages. You can look at your events. And you can understand what the API offers. So with that, I want to kind of set the stage as to what are the few things that I want you to take away. One is we will see how you can get session information from the SharePoint side. And then I will show you a CRUD operation, which is create a calendar event, update a calendar event, remove a calendar event, and send an email. But before that, let me quickly just give you a brief on the different features and what are the top entities that they offer. So calendar has two sets of permissions, read and read write. It's self-explanatory. Access to do gets on all these entities that you see below. So you can do an HTTP get on all of them. And read and write will allow you to do posts, patches, deletes on whatever entities we have allowed that on, and perform actions. So the first one you see that is calendar group. It's basically a grouping of calendars that you might want to view frequently, like your office colleagues or your family. And then what do calendar groups contain? They contain calendars. By default, we are all used to having a default calendar in our Exchange Online account, but you have the ability to create multiple calendars. And that's the calendar collection. Then calendar can contain events within them. This is the most interesting one. I think most people are going to use this the most, which is all the appointments and events that you have in your calendar. Here you can do create, update, delete, and accept, decline, and tentatively accept. Those three, by the way, are actions that you can perform on the event. And of course, events can contain attachments within them, and you can create, update, or delete them. Now here below, I have a couple of samples that give you an idea of how simple the URL structure is to use. And it's very intuitive, right? So if you just go to the root and say me, and say I want to view my calendar, you will see all the calendar properties. Further, if you say, OK, I want to see all the events within this calendar, you go /events, and you can see all the events under the calendar. Mail has one extra permission. Not only does it have read, write, but it also has send. And the reason is that, talking to a lot of folks, we kind of got the feedback that send privileges on mail, people are very wary of. They wanted to keep it separate. And that's why for sending email, you need to have the send privilege. But for creating emails and storing them in, say, some folder or attachments, you can just use the write privileges. So with mail, you have folder, of course. These are different folders, which could be your well-known folders like inbox or sent items, or they could be the folders that you create. You can update them, delete them, and move and copy them. Folders can contain messages, and messages have a very rich set of features with it. You can reply all, forward, or create reply. And this is interesting because if you look at create reply, you can use create reply with the right permission. Whereas for reply, you'll need the send permissions because reply will actually send the message, whereas create reply will store it. And messages can contain attachments further. And a few more samples here down which show you how you can play with the mail APIs. So if you see down below, you'll see me/inbox. Now, I don't have inbox listed here, right? That's because what we've done is for convenience, again, we've created 4 different well-known folder names which you can access for the most common use cases. So you can go to me/inbox or deleted items or drafts or sent items. And those are readily available, and those are just folder names. If you don't want to do that, you can also just go me/folders, and within parentheses, you can give the folder ID. Again, within inbox, you can go to messages. It's the same as events. The last one, contacts. Contacts have, again, read and read write. It's pretty light, right? We have contact folders and contacts. Contact folders contain contacts. We don't have create update on contact folders yet. These are things that we are going to take feedback from you folks and add. A couple of more samples. One thing I want to note here is that these are the contacts that you have within your mailbox, right? These are not the global address list, which is your organizational contacts. If you want to get a list of that, you need to use the Graph API to get the users in the org. right, now I want to just go to the demo. Close this down. So yeah, so we earlier saw in the demo that you got the token, how you can use the refresh token to get multiple different tokens for Exchange and SharePoint. What we are going to do is we are going to use those tokens to first get a list of items from the SharePoint list. So let me show you, in fact. So here is the user we are going to use. And I want to just show you the SharePoint list actually on SharePoint so you can see what are we grabbing from. Come on. It is slow today. Well, let me do. Oh, it's going. So yeah, so you see basically the list of the sessions that we have on the SharePoint site, and oh my God. Come on. All right. So this is the list of courses that we have. Anyway, I think I'll come back to that when it loads up. But here, this is my calendar for the user that I'm going to use. And this link will basically show you all the sessions that are available. So we'll come back and see if it loads up. And the first thing we'll do is try and add one of those sessions to our calendar. I'm not going to show you the code for grabbing the sessions from the session list because it follows the same pattern that we will use for grabbing the session for calendar and stuff. So here's my add calendar method. This is what we'll invoke. Let's give it a try. So as you saw earlier, so this is a user that we've consented before. We used the Azure token to get the user profile information. Now we are going to use the SharePoint one to get the session list. I think something is wrong because it's taking too long to load even on the site. Here. So we got the session that I wanted to show you before. This is what we should see here. In there. Whew. All right, so we grabbed all the sessions in your native app, and what we do is we say, hey, for this date that this session is on, please show me the calendar events that this person has, so that you can decide, okay, do I have time to take the session or not? So if I go back to my calendar, you'll see that these are the two events that I already have on this day, right? So now I'm going to try and saying, I'm interested in the session. I want to put this on my calendar. I hit the breakpoint. First thing I do is I grab the session that I want to add. Of my calendar events. And what I do here is I convert the session, which is a SharePoint item, into a calendar. So I take the ID, the SharePoint ID, and I put it as a SharePoint ID in the calendar event. I put the start date, end date. I create a friendly subject, which contains the session code and the SharePoint ID. and I add the location. Where did I go? Oh, shoot. Let me add another one. So here, go in further. So the first thing I do is I say, hey, is this session already on my calendar or not, right? Because if it is, then it becomes an update. So I'm going to make a query which is going to say, give me all the sessions which have this SharePoint ID in the subject. So if you see the construct here, it says, I'm trying to filter where the subject contains a SharePoint ID. Because if you look at the request URL, it says, give me all the calendar events, contains this. I'm going to, and my item count is 0, which means this is a new. To add an event, the endpoint you use is the events collection. So you go to me calendar event, and you basically do a post here. So we take our calendar object, we serialize it as a JSON body. It's just a set of name value pairs. And this serializing, you have for all platforms, you have for JavaScript. There are many, many serializers available. We use the data contract serializer. And now we've created a request object, and we're ready to send the request over. I added the accept header and the content type header. And if you just go there, my response is 201, which is created. So I should have this session now in calendar. So there, we added it here. This is the one for the second one that we added. We can go and verify and look at our calendar to see if it's there. Those are 2 sessions. I want to go and update one of the sessions that I've added. So let's go and change something in one of the sessions that we have. So I'm going to edit. Let's change these to that. Save. Go back to my app, refresh the session list, and there, I have 17A now. Now I want to update this. So I go to the same code, but this time, when I pass this query, it's going to return 1 because this exists. So if you look at the update URL, we are calling events of the event ID. So you want to this time say, I want to update an event. You give the event ID, and you do a patch request on that. So if you see here, I'm going a patch request. When I do enter, I get a response saying 200, which is all good. And I let it run through, and it's gotten updated with MEG17A here. So that's how update works. The last thing I want to show is remove before I show the mail thing. So let's say I'm like, you know what, no, the session was not what I thought it would be. I want to remove this. So you call the remove functionality. You grab the calendar event that you want to delete this time, and you call the delete method. Now, the URL for deleting is the same as update, right? You want to identify the event that you want to delete by providing the event ID, and you call the delete method. There is no request body required here because you're just trying to delete. We send the request over, and 204 deleted, no content back. So we should, there, this is gone from here, and it should be gone from our calendar too. Go back and check there, this session is gone. So that's basically how you can easily write an application that's basic CRUD, where you can get events, update events, shows right back on your real calendar. What else? Yeah, the next thing I wanted to kind of show you was also the send functionality on the mail, where we will now have this session that you are interested in. You are like, hey, I want to share it with my friends, right? I'm going to the session. A colleague of mine is attending the conference. I want to share the session with him so that maybe he would also be interested in attending. So there we are. So I call the share, I give his ID, and I've already pre-filled some of the information like the subject and body, right, with interesting information that you might have anyway wanted to add. So I'm saying, hey, I'm attending this session, this is the location of this session. I call send. I first create a message type. Now let me just go quickly into the message object, right? So if you see here, I have a message class, which I have handcrafted, which contains the basic properties of the message class. Now you don't really need to do this, and as Matthias was pointing earlier, we have libraries which have been created and SDKs for Android and for Visual Studio, which will automatically create all these for you. So this is more to give you an idea of, even if you don't have those, it's a very easy thing to go and create a class which contains the basic properties for you to serialize into. Where was I? So yeah, so I set the values like who am I sending this email to, what's the subject and the body. I call my send mail method. I make sure I have a valid token. And to send a mail, the URL you use is me/messages. Again, you create the post data, which contains all the different properties of your message. You call it, and it will quickly be done. So yeah, so I'll show you if I get the message back. But that's an email message. It's a time check. All right. So as I was mentioning, right, we want to make sure these REST APIs are available not only for Windows platforms. We want to make sure that people who are developing on various platforms like iOS and Android can also have a great development experience when they try to use our REST APIs. And for that, we had an open source project which helps Android developers who want to build against the whole Platform 365 APIs. So not only mail, calendar, contacts, but also files, lists. You can go and download it today from preview in Office Dev from GitHub. This is sample code, right, which shows you the development experience. Say, for example, if you're in Eclipse, and if you wanted to use it against our REST API, you would do things like me.get drafts, drafts.get messages, right? So you don't have to use the URL structure. That's more to show you how the bare bones works. But in reality, you would use one of these SDKs, like or our Office 365 SDK for Windows, and you will get this first-class experience inside your development environment. Actually, I did have a demo which we built. So we built a sample Android app. There it is, which kind of showcases how to get various mail functionality and stuff. So there, right? So we have 3 tabs here for the 3 features. We are doing a basic get. So it's going and getting all the emails for this logged in user. Let me do something quickly. You know what happened. Let's relaunch it. Just take a second. But yeah, this SDK, we use this SDK to build this app, and it was this app is also available for download, right, Matthias? Yeah. Maybe that's the reason. Yep. So you have the calendar events, and then you can also go and send the email. So it shows you basic functionality. Well, one more thing I want to just touch upon quickly is, because we are using OData, you get a lot of free querying capabilities. So, a lot of people write REST APIs, but it's not easy. You have to do a lot of filtering yourself. But OData provides a lot of filtering capabilities which you can use to do various things. For example, if you wanted to just get the first 5 messages from the inbox, right, you can use that parameter. All OData parameters are preceded by $, so you know that this is a system parameter. So you can say, give me the first 5 messages. And then you want to say, you know what, I want to skip the first 5, give me the next 10. You can use the skip parameter. This is what you will use to do paging in your app. So if you want to page 10 items at a time, you can use stop and skip together to do that. You want to sort your messages, of course, with datetime created. So you can use the order by. You can add a descending DESC in the end, and it'll do it either ascending or descending. Then there's the other one, right? You want to only get select properties, because a lot of times when you're writing apps for smaller devices like tablets or for phone, you want to make sure your payload is small. So for that, you can use the select and say, I'm just interested in getting these 3 properties. And you can use the select parameter for that. And then they have a powerful parameter called filter, which can use not only a lot of functions, but also arithmetic operators greater than, equal to, and you can combine all that to create complex queries, just like SQL type queries or link type queries. So in this example, I want to get all the messages which have start of greater than particular date. Right now in the REST APIs, all dates are in UTC. We don't have time zone support yet, which we are going to add in the future. And then contacts. This is another example of just using one of those string functions, right? So you have starts with and ends with. This is just some best practices. When you are creating your app, we would request that you add important headers like user agent, client request ID, and stuff, because it helps us find the requests on our side easily. And for you, if you have failed requests, you should maintain a failure log for troubleshooting. But you take the whole response that you get back and store it so that you can correlate very easily. Again, be mindful of requests that generate large responses, not only because you don't want to get a lot of data which can have a negative performance impact on your app, but also because you don't want to make too many requests which will potentially lead to your app getting throttled. Be conservative with the number of requests you make, and use OData's URL conventions to make narrower requests so you can get exactly just what you want. So that's kind of the end of it. I want to have Matthias back to maybe just talk a little bit about the summary and key takeaways.
Okay, so that was the first part of the session. So we learned all about authentication. Hopefully I got you a very good idea about how easy and simple it actually indeed can be, right, for your application to leverage the same authentication framework that our own services are doing. I think that is one of the key things that you have to keep in mind, right? Your application will be not any different than we that are running our services regards authenticating the user, right, and using the APIs. I don't use basic auth anymore. There is no reason, we hope. Right,
unless you're using it for what I said, which is to explore the API.
So we will have a little discussion in the background there, but we'll see who wins that. But don't use basic.
Don't fight it, Jordan.
No basic, no basic, no basic, no basic auth. So some key takeaway we want everybody to move away. If you use our REST APIs, the new auth framework is the one you should be using. And please use the client libraries to do so. Right? They really tremendously help you, right? And especially for the various device applications, we put a lot of efforts in there to make them available for iOS, for Android, right, for you to use.
For Mail Calendar, I would say, the main takeaway I would ask you to take to consider is that you can now create applications that can stitch across, various Office workloads like SharePoint, Exchange, Azure Active Directory, Link, and this will allow you to create an application using a single unified programming model where you don't have to do different things, and you can enable powerful scenarios with targeted scopes, of course, right? So you ask the user exactly for the things that you need, nothing more. And again, we are hoping that the REST APIs will provide a lightweight and quick way for companies to not only onboard quickly, because they are all common standards, but also develop apps on various platforms. So yeah, so these are some of the, this slide deck will be available online. These are some of the references which talk to the documentation that's available for the various things that we talked about, the SDKs that we talked about, right? The Android SDK, the ADAL libraries, and the demo app itself that we showed you is also available online. And a couple of recommended sessions which are happening today, tomorrow. Some of them have been listed here, which we think are going to be good to get a further sense of what are the different apps that we can develop for business apps. I think you mentioned the one which is happening tomorrow at 1:30.
Yeah, tomorrow 1:30. So if you wonder, there was a question about Napa and mail app. So you actually see we have a session tomorrow at 11:45, I believe, where we talk about apps for Outlook is the title. And we actually use this framework in a mail app too. So you are not limited today, right, using the auth framework only with web server apps and native device apps. You will see it working tomorrow if you are interested, right, also in the Apps of Outlook session within Agave. If you want to go back, one more, right, so all the samples that you see, they are available. You can have code, you can download the code, you can start using the code right away to play around, right? That's also very important, right? So you don't have to reinvent the wheel there and get a quick start. And by all means, right, please contact us, right? I'm very, very happy to get in contact, right, with as many people as I can, right? Answer questions that you have using our auth framework, right? Get you started there, right? And not using basic auth anymore. You get the theme. Okay.
And that's about it. Thanks so much. For questions, people can, come by. We will be here. So if you have questions, we can answer any.